Why are there still so many police shootings and not enough police officers, plus some new text messages, finally, that may shed some light on what happened before the Palisades fire? It's the Leonard Files Podcast. It's Friday, December 12th, 2025. A couple of LAPD issues to address, and then we can move on to the Palisades fire latest, which has to do with not the Palisades fire itself on January 7th, the one that was so destructive, but the fire that happened 6 days earlier on January 1st around midnight. In fact, the only fire for which the alleged arsonist for the Palisades fire has been charged. He hasn't been charged with the Palisades fire. He's been charged with the January 1st fire, which the ATF says later caused the Palisades fire. But interestingly, no charges have been filed in the Palisades fire yet. Anyway, there's some revelations there, some new things we know today that we didn't know last week as we continue to cover all the things that are happening related to the investigation and now the lawsuits that have been filed by thousands of Palisades fire victims who want to hold the city of Los Angeles and the state of California responsible. But before we do that, we should really turn to the LAPD this week and two persistent, chronic issues that involve the local police department. One of them is the amount of violence that officers use, and the other one is whether or not there are too few officers to begin with. And those two things may actually be related. So, first to the violence. As we've been tracking throughout the year, the number of shootings involving LAPD officers, meaning the times officers fired their guns on duty, has continued to rise. We reported on this on Monday, where we calculated, based on our own mathing, that by the first week of December 2025, LAPD officers had been involved in 43 on-duty shootings, as compared with 26 at this time last year. And it begs the question, what the heck is going on? So here is a little bit of the story that we put on the news, and then we'll have a little extra information to share. The police shooting this morning in Reseda marks at least the 40... By the way, this morning would be Monday, December 8th, so not today. Second time this year that officers have fired their guns on duty. At this time last year, that number was 26. The department's latest data shows this year's numbers are well above a four-year average, and this year's number already tops the 37 police shootings recorded in 2021, when overall violent crime rates were much higher. Over the summer, the Board of Police Commissioners, which provides public oversight of the LAPD, asked for research and more information on the circumstances of all of these shootings, which, as we reported in July, had already begun to increase significantly by mid-year. At the time, LAPD Chief Jim McDonald told me it was because more of the people officers were confronting this year were armed with real or look-alike weapons. Okay, so I'm just going to stop it there. That pretty much sets up what's going on right now. So mid-year, back in July, the number of police shootings that had been recorded by the LAPD was higher than it had been in years past. And the chief says it's because officers are being confronted with more people who are armed with weapons that have left officers with few choices other than to use their guns. But what's interesting about that, and the reason that this caught our attention, was that seems to contrast with the overall rate of violent crime nationally and in Southern California. Nationally, violent crime is at an all-time low overall. There is, unfortunately, the national data lags behind local data. We can look at local stuff much more quickly. Local data also shows the same. Fewer homicides, fewer people being murdered. That's across Southern California in every county. It is true for the city of Los Angeles as well as the county of Los Angeles. And there are also fewer people being shot, which is, in my mind, almost a more significant measure, because that really helps to capture the level of street violence or criminal violence that's out there, as opposed to murders, which some component of those are, I don't want to call them unavoidable, but they happen despite the best intentions and work of our society. Domestic violence cases in particular, those are going to happen almost no matter what the police department does. Some number of them are going to happen. So it's really the street crime where arguably the police department has the greatest opportunity to prevent violent crime from happening. So that's the number we really want to look at. And so for all of LA County and the city of Los Angeles, that number is down. I think there's some 70 fewer victims of violence, shootings in particular this year than there were last year. But when you look back 2 years, we were already on a huge decline. It's hundreds fewer victims, both in murders and people that are shot each year. So it is even more startling that the levels of street violence are dropping and the levels of police using violence are going up. Because those two things, even though they're not directly correlated with one another, it stands to reason that the two kind of go together. If there are more people using guns in violence on the streets of Southern California, the chances that law enforcement officers, LAPD officers, are going to come in contact with that are much higher than if the level's lower. And so back to the original question, what the heck is happening here? I'm going to turn to the police commission meeting this week. This is the oversight board that is supposed to provide public monitoring and policy setting for the LAPD. They had a meeting this week. This was the day after the story aired that you just saw. It's interesting. We asked the LAPD about this on Monday before we put our story on television and online, and the department never responded. Which is a little unusual. Usually they at least tell us we're not going to have information, we have no comment, nothing from them. And then the next morning, the chief goes to the police commission meeting and essentially answers the questions that we had from the day before. Here is what he had to say.
That's an increase, significant, and we spent a great deal of time looking at what's driving it. What the analysis shows is that the encounters our officers are facing this year are more violent and more dangerous. This year, 18 of those incidents involved suspects armed with a firearm, compared with 12 last year, for about a 50% increase. We're also seeing more imitation or replica guns being used. 9 incidents this year involved a replica firearm compared to 4 last year. In the middle of a fast, unpredictable situation, those replica guns look identical to real firearms, and officers have to make decisions in seconds. We've also seen an increase in suspects armed with knives or edged weapons, 10 incidents this year compared to 6 last year, which is a 66.7% increase. Another major factor is that suspects are firing at our officers more often. This year, officers have been shot at 12 times compared to 7 times last year, again, roughly a 70% increase. That kind of rise has a direct impact on the number of officer-involved shooting incidents. When individuals are shooting at officers, those encounters certainly escalate very quickly.
Okay, so he's saying that police officers are being targeted more often than they had been in years past. And that may be true. I mean, certainly true based on the data that they have. What I mean is that may be happening in LA more than it is somewhere else. And one of the questions that I have for the chief, if we ever speak with him again, is why is this apparently a uniquely Los Angeles problem? I'm going to turn back to the story that we had on television. I'm going to skip past what the chief said here. The video's not so great, but you're going to see here one of the new police commissioners, Jeff Scobin, ask, why is this just L.A., or is this just L.A.? And here's what happened there.
That have taken place in the last week. On December 2nd, a detective driving in the west...
Oops, sorry. I'm just recounting all of the ones in the last week. Let me skip... I went the wrong way. Maybe I didn't put it in here. I thought I did. In any case, the question from one of the Board of Police Commissioners members was this happening elsewhere? And so the chief said he's going to do some more research and get back. Nationally, the FBI does collect statistics on how many times officers use force and how many times officers, law enforcement officers of all kinds, are the targets of attacks. That data for 2025 isn't available. It lags months and months and months behind real time. The data for 2024 is out there. I didn't see anything remarkable in it. Most significantly, though, the other big law enforcement agency in Southern California is the Sheriff's Department. And so we called up the Sheriff's Department to find out if all of these LAPD officers are being attacked at a higher rate and with more lethal weapons than they have been in the past, at least statistically? Is the same thing happening in the sheriff's department? And the answer is no. The sheriff's department has had fewer deputy-involved shootings as of this first week of December in 2025 than it did at this time in 2024, and the overall number is about half of the LAPD. Granted, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. The sheriff's doesn't patrol quite as many people population-wise. You can't draw a one-to-one comparison between the two, but they're both big police agencies, and generally, crime trends that we see in the city of Los Angeles tend to be mirrored in the county of Los Angeles. There is nobody believes that there's some artificial border living in the minds of people who want to go out and do harm or commit some crime, and they do commit it in one part but not in the other. Things happen in both places all the time, and it is only a stranger factor in all of this. One of the stranger things that's gone on in our look at this in the last week and then previously in the last few months, that these two departments that patrol the same general community in Southern California have similar sizes of officers or deputies out in the community. We're going to really look forward to whatever it is that the city of Los Angeles comes back with in its research and its comparisons with what's gone on in the sheriff's department. The sheriff's shootings that we saw, because they publish a public overview of the at least the fatal and injury-causing sheriff shootings this year. I think there's 11 or 12 online. There may be one more than that in the actual number that just hasn't been added yet. They look like they're confronting people who are armed as well. There's a couple of them in there where deputies interrupted domestic violence attacks, stabbings in progress. And there's others where they confronted people who were armed with guns. So the same things may be happening. Again, it just begs the question, why is it happening less often in the county than it is in the city? One thing that a retired LAPD person told me that we may need to look into is the tactics that are being used by officers and whether or not the ideas of de-escalation and buying yourself more time and those things are really trickling down into the field operations of the department. It seems like they are, but we'll see what the LAPD comes up with and go from there. All right, so the other LAPD happening this week that was pretty interesting was from the mayor's office, which was this letter that she sent to the LA City Council demanding that the council come up with $4.4 million in its last days of counseling before they go on break until after the new year to fund the continued training and hiring of new LAPD officers. And this requires a little bit of context because the letter itself could be confusing if it's not placed in the right spot in our understanding of the city's finances. So let's rewind a few months. June 2025, the city of LA and its city council is holding meetings and debates to figure out how it is going to manage a roughly $1 billion shortfall in what was forecast a long time ago of the city revenue, meaning all the money that comes in from the various taxes and fees that lets the city operate. And the reality was $1 billion short of what the city had hoped to receive. There are all kinds of reasons that is happening that have nothing to do with what we're talking about. But the reality was the council had to figure out how is it going to not stop doing city stuff and also not exceed the amount of money that is projected to come in. And another thing to keep in mind here is that city and municipal finance is a little bit different from the banking that most of us do. A lot of it is based on forecasts and assumptions, and the actual costs of things oftentimes exceed what has been allotted in a budget, and the money kind of materializes from one source or another. But in broad terms, the city had to cut $1 billion in spending. So the first thing the city did was cut unhired or unfilled vacant positions from virtually every department in the city. So if people had retired in the last couple of years and those jobs hadn't been filled, they're not going to be filled now. There's a general hiring freeze. The city's not hiring new employees for most positions while this budget issue is dealt with. Certain services are going to get cut back. The fire department's budget, as we covered extensively, even though it has gone up numbers-wise, dollars-wise in the last few years, what that money actually pays for has shrunk. So that's why there were complaints about all those fire apparatus, the engines and ladder trucks and things that were in a state of disrepair at the time the Palisades fire started. There weren't enough mechanics to work on them. And so the city is constantly trying to juggle all of these priorities. And this year, as the city was grappling with this billion-dollar deficit and eliminating positions and discussing a hiring freeze, the council, for the most part, agreed that it could not stop hiring new police officers. The LAPD has shrunk majorly in the last few years. At one point, it was approaching 10,000 officers. That seemed to be a staffing level that was constantly bandied about by various politicians. We're going to get the LAPD to 10,000 officers. LA is under-policed if you use the barometer of other major cities in the United States. We have fewer officers per population than other big cities, and there's obviously a debate that's been going on about whether that's necessary, whether there should be more or should be fewer, but the department is at its smallest size in, decades. It's below 9,000. The last count in the last week, it's about 8,670, and in the first few months of 2026, which is always when the retirings amass, and that has to do with pension and retirement benefits. Everyone bails out after the first of the year. They're expecting about 500 officers to leave. There are 160 odd officers at some phase of academy training. There was a class that graduated this morning. I believe there were 56 in that. So let's say 110, 115 remaining at some stage of training in academy classes that have begun over the last few months. So 86, 70, 500 leave. Now we're down to 8,100, 8,200. There's 110, 120 plus the 50, so 160 in the pipeline. Now we're around 8,300 or so. And that's what the mayor sent this letter about, which is that the city of LA, even though it has authorized the hiring of up to, I think it's around 8,700 officers. I know this is a lot of numbers, but in order for the letter to make sense, you kind of got to follow this. It can't afford to go through the process of processing and hiring and doing the background checks and running the police academies without additional funding starting in January. So the department's got these people leaving. It's got some people in the pipeline, but the mayor says in her letter here that if the city council doesn't come up with another $4.5 million today, the January police academy class isn't going to happen. She says in her letter, I urge you to prioritize the safety of Angelenos and allocate $4.4 million to hire 410 officers for this fiscal year ending in June 2025. She actually means June 2026. The fiscal year goes from July to June each year, but it's called the 2025-2026 fiscal year because it starts in 2025, ends in 2026. And here's where a lot of this got confusing. It says 410 officers. Well, obviously, $4.4 million doesn't pay the salaries of 410 officers. Officers at the beginning of their career cost somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000 a year between pay and benefits and the various other costs associated with employing them. So $4.4 million would not get you many officers. So what the letter's referring to is the cost of hiring additional officers up to the authorized level that was approved by the council in the budget. So going back to the budget talks where they're cutting and cutting and cutting, the mayor says, I want 410 new officers in the LAPD by the end of the fiscal year, which is June 2026. The council comes back and says, well, we don't have that much money. We'll pay for about 250 of them. So those are the officers we're talking about that are already in some phase of training or just beginning their careers in the department. And now that money has been exhausted. And so the mayor is saying to the council, we cannot afford to let the LAPD shrink any more than it has. The department has cut back on all kinds of services and its ability to respond to things that are going on in public, not just emergency calls, but doing the things that you hope prevent the emergency calls down the road. And the council may or may not come up with the money. It's not a lot of money as city budgets are concerned. I think this year's city budget was like $14.4 billion. So the idea that the council could find $4 million and change in some fund somewhere and then shift it over to make sure the hiring goes on is certainly possible. The other reality is that the tax revenue coming into the city, we haven't seen the latest forecast. It usually comes out in the early part of the year as the city begins its massive process of figuring out the next year's budget. But tax revenues aren't great. They're not great anywhere. And so the reductions that the city had to make in last year's budget might only amplify this year. We don't know just yet. Anyway, the council will make a decision. It will be interesting to see if hiring continues. These are for recruits who have already been selected, have been given a start date for the police academy, and then may get letters in the next couple of weeks that say, too bad, so sad. We've made other plans. The city can no longer afford to keep you on, and we're going to not start the police academy in January. All right, I'm going to turn to our last big story of the week, which has to do with the Palisades fire and whether or not state employees that work for the State Parks Department had something to do with the decisions that were made after that first of the two fires in the Palisades, the Lackman fire, which burned around midnight on New Year's. This is the fire that the ATF says caused the Palisades fire 6 days later because they said smoldering embers were burning underground that whole time and actually caused it. So let me play you a little bit of the story we reported, and I'll give you a little more insight into it.
Emerging from the lawsuits filed by thousands of fire victims in the Palisades, text messages from state officials could help explain what happened in the days before that fire.
Our investigative reporter Eric Leonard is live on a newsroom with what these messages reveal. Eric.
We're seeing for the first time messages and maps exchanged by California State Parks employees on the morning of the Lackman fire, January 1st. Lawyers for the Palisades fire victims who are suing say these messages could suggest that some of those employees were worried that firefighting would impact environmentally sensitive plants and sites, and they plan to visit the scene of the fire.
Screenshots of the messages included in new court filings show state parks workers assigned to Topanga State Park were discussing what to do in order to protect endangered astragalus plants along roads and trails, right where the January 1st Lackman fire had burned the night before. One employee writing, "So I imagine they are cutting at least some astragalus with those hand crews. We will hold for now until I hear heavy equipment is being deployed." Another message, "There is an endangered plant population and a cultural site in the immediate area." Another employee texted back the next morning with a photo of the burn area. "Hose lay leaks are tearing up small bits of the trail." And someone else responding, "Can you make sure no suppression impacts at Skull Rock, please?" Skull Rock is close to where both Palisades fires ignited. And these state parks maps with some information redacted were also in the court filing. They show areas that appear to be within the Lackman burn area that the state deemed as avoidance areas, where no heavy equipment or digging should be allowed.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there because this is really the key thing that we've been hearing from the fire victims who are behind this lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, the state of California, and are alleging that the government, in a variety of different ways, was negligent and created a hazardous condition which allowed the Palisades fire to spread essentially unchecked, causing the losses of thousands of homes, businesses, and 12 deaths. A couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, these text messages are being produced by subpoena, meaning a court order, because the Palisades fire victims who are filing these lawsuits are being allowed to do a little bit of investigation before the court makes its ultimate decision about whether or not these lawsuits are even going to go towards trial. And the reason that's significant is because this could all be meaningless. We're just getting little bits and pieces of information here. Granted, I think it's newsworthy, but they're just fragments that may or may not amount to anything. the legal bar for suing the government for something like this is very high. And both the city of Los Angeles and the state of California have their lawyers in court who have asked the judge to dismiss this completely, not even allow these lawsuits to go forward, not because none of this is true, but because in their view, none of it reaches the threshold that would allow them to allow a lawsuit alleging these things to even go to trial. That decision hasn't been made yet. It's going to happen sometime in January or February at the earliest. But the judge is allowing this investigation to happen sooner, which was the subject of some of our reporting last week, because it does seem like there's some there, and the plaintiffs, meaning the fire victims, want the opportunity to investigate using the power of the court to compel the production of documents like those text messages and maps, and also to compel these state employees and LA City firefighters to come in and sit for a deposition, meaning give testimony, answer questions under oath that's admissible in court later on. The state parks employees who exchanged those messages were being deposed this week. Some of the firefighters who were out there are being deposed next week. And the gist of this, if it wasn't clear in the little clip I played, is that the lawyers for the fire victims say they believe those environmental concerns discussed by the state parks employees, whose job it is to protect state land and all of its wildlife, interfered with the competing need for the LA City Fire Department to fully extinguish the Lackman fire on January 1st. And they have some indications, and there's rumors and words circulating, that in fact something happened that prevented the fire department from doing as thorough a job as it ordinarily would have in digging up places where there was still smoldering ground or smoldering embers from that first fire. It is important to remember the state of California has denied this emphatically. On the record, in court, a spokesperson for the state park said it is a ludicrous idea to think that the Parks Department would put the needs of protecting plants over those of protecting homes and preventing fires. So they say this is completely not true. But the text messages, which were produced as part of this exploration, show that there was at least a concern about these things. What happened next is still a mystery. That's what the depositions of the state parks employees should help lead to. And then certainly the depositions of these firefighters, there's a dozen of them who are going to come in for depositions and say what it is that happened that day, the day after the Lackman fire, while they were still mopping up, making sure there were no hot spots or embers. Did they do that completely, or did something happen that caused them to leave early? And if that turns out to be true, it could really change a lot of our thinking about both of these fires, and certainly it may even affect the criminal case, because the defense lawyer for the man who's accused by federal prosecutors of igniting the Lackman fire says his defense is going to involve the what he said was the lack of firefighting by the government in controlling that fire if, in fact, this case goes to trial. So this all is kind of intertwined, and one case may affect the other one. We're going to have to wait and see how all of that plays out with the depositions this week and next week, and then the criminal case moving forward. And I think our next time in court, in criminal court, is going to be next month, and perhaps we'll see some kind of action or motions or requests from the defense to try to learn more about this. After all, it was the defense's inquiries about these text messages that started this whole thing happening. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now. We're going to continue to follow the Palisades story, what's going on with the LAPD, both in the hiring and in this seemingly inexplicable number of police shootings that have happened in 2025. And as we get more information, we'll bring it to you. So be sure to click like and subscribe on our YouTube channel so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. I'll see you next time.